and this is a question for both Hugh and Paul. What would you say is the example of fine tuning that maybe keeps you up at night? That is just so provocative. Now, as a biochemist, I think that the fine tuning of the nuclear or the resonance of the nuclear energy levels of beryllium and carbon and oxygen is remarkable, because the implications, of course, is that it leads to a universe where carbon and oxygen are in high abundance. And as a life scientist, that's really very important. And that, to me, that's the fine tuning example that really keeps me up at night. I'm just curious, Paul and Hugh, what would be that one example that you think is real provocative?
Well, it's hard to pick one example. I mean, what keeps me up at night is the recognition. You need the entire universe, as massive, as old, as vast as it is, just to get one body on which human beings or the functional equivalent can exist. But to be honest, I think what really keeps me up is just looking at the Earth, Moon, Sun system, and maybe the planets that go with it, and just realizing, that's where you really see extraordinary fine tuning. And what does all this imply?
So if I could just answer that question, because I always feel I should pay lip service to Fred Hoyle for the simple reason he gave me my first job in Cambridge decades ago. And it was he who drew attention to this so-called carbon resonance. He worked along with others in the 1950s on where did the elements come from, the chemical elements. If the Big Bang coughed out hydrogen and helium, what about all the rest? And what about carbon, the life-giving element? And there's no simple reaction, fusion reaction, whereby two nuclei that are lighter than carbon can collide and form carbon. And Fred reckoned that there must be a coincidence in the arrangement of the energy levels of these nuclei, so that when three helium nuclei came together, there was what is called a resonance. It's an enhanced reaction that would have produced that carbon. And he was sort of laughed at the time, but sure enough, he was right. And so he was much struck by the fact that if the nuclear force were slightly different from what it is, there would be no carbon and no life and no Fred Hoyle. So that's the famous one, and it's reappeared again and again over the years. I'm probably slightly more struck by the fact that the universe as a whole does seem to have an astonishing degree of uniformity, but it's not quite perfectly uniform. This is something I worked on myself many years ago, that it was born in a state of extraordinary smoothness, but with a tiny, tiny departure from that, which is enough to explain the emergence of the large-scale structure, the galaxies, and then the stars, and eventually the planets, and so on, without which, of course, we couldn't be here. So things were set up in this way where the interplay between quantum mechanics and gravitation was just such as to give this happy arrangement of things. Now, there are attempts to explain this in terms of what's called the inflationary universe scenario and quantum effects around that. And that's all great. I follow it very carefully. I contributed to it and I follow it with fascination. But I'm not totally sold on the idea that is what has happened. So it looks like the universe was set up initially in a rather special state.
And Paul, if I understood you correctly a little bit back, it sounded like you said it's more important for some things to be fine-tuned and
yes.
than it is for others,
yes.
And that it's not mandatory for all of it to be finely tuned. Hugh, are you in agreement with that?
Yes, I am. I mean, the degree of fine tuning you see in the different parameters, whether you're talking about the universe or galaxy, our planetary system, yeah, they're different. Some are highly fine-tuned, some are just not so much fine-tuned. But what fascinates me is whatever parameter you look at, you find some degree of fine-tuning that's needed to explain our existence.
Of course, we don't know, as I said earlier, whether some of these quantities which don't seem to be terribly important might eventually become tied via a better theory to some of the quantities which are more important for fine-tuning. We don't know what the final set will be. And there's a whole group, about a third of theoretical physicists, a big chunk, believe that we shall have one day a final theory in which there will be no free parameters. Everything will be nailed down, that all of these numbers we're talking about will come out of the theory, nothing left to explain. So that's a different way of looking at it.
So let me ask you a question, if I may, Paul, because I'm a biochemist, but I do a little bit of reading in theoretical physics, which is a very toxic cocktail, potentially, at least intellectually speaking. But do you believe that the constants of physics are actually constants, or do you think that they were shaped through the process of inflation? So
yes, a whole lecture on this. Well, a good friend of mine thinks that there's good evidence that even on the timescales that we can inspect, that is over billions of years, he thinks that there's evidence for slight changes in one of these constants called the fine structure constant. It's the strength with which electrons couple to light. I'm not 100% sure that evidence is good, but we've sort of dodged around the issue. But the prevailing view now among most of my cosmology colleagues is there's not just one universe, one Big Bang, that there were bangs scattered throughout space and time, and that as the universe, our universe, cooled from its ultra-hot, ultra-dense primordial state, that many of these numbers we've been talking about, even the laws themselves, sort of congealed out a little bit like what happens when water freezes to ice. You get all sorts of, imagine an ice flow in the Arctic or something, all sorts of complicated shapes. And you say, well, why is it that shape and why is that iceberg that big and so on? And the answer is, well, it's just happenstance. And so there's a point of view that although these numbers might be and probably are constant eventually, that in the turmoil of the Big Bang, it was all up for grabs. And so it all has to do with the way the universe cooled. I mean, literally the way the cosmic cookie crumbled.